Welcome back, all you lovely people. As always, I hope you had a good snack. Now you're ready to keep on talking about the common good. So now in the last video, we saw that when your appeals to the common good revolve around three sorts of things: a normative claim, a triggering condition, and a practical constraint. And so now Alex considers what he calls the corporate conception of the common good and how it understands, again, this relationship between the common good and individual interests. And so if we go back to page 19, go up to the top of the center column, here you can see Alex say, one fairly natural way to contrast the interests of individuals and the common good is to identify the common good with the good of the community, conceived of as an entity that exists in its own right, with interests that are distinct from those of its individual members. On this view, the normative claim draws a fairly blunt distinction between the good of two different parties. One party is monadic, the individual agent, and the other is corporate, the collective agent or the body politic. And now, here we go. We can see how the corporate conception answers the questions raised by the normative claim. The common good, because remember the questions were what's the common good and what are the individual interests? So the corporate conception says the common good is the good of the community taken as a whole, while the individual interests are just the good or interests for each member of that community. And this might sound really familiar, I hope, because this approach looks and sounds a lot like utilitarianism, right? Because the individual interests are just the individual utilities, right? The happiness or whatever you want to call it, the individual utilities for each person involved, right? And each of us has a number or a set of numbers, depending on what kind of utilitarian you are. But either way, each of us has a set of numbers or a number associated with our utility, our individual utility. And then the common good, right, is that social utility. And of course, social utility is the aggregate sum of all of our individual utilities. You have utility, I have utility, and the group's utility is just sums those all up together. And that gives us the social good or the social utility. But again, notice we're seeing what Alex is saying here, which is pretty interesting, is that there are two different types of entities involved. On the one hand, there's you and me, where we are individual persons with our own personal interests, whatever, you're interested in things, I'm interested in things, right? So those are the individual monadic, he says, entities, right? Each of us, we're monadic, we're individuals. But then there is the composite entity, the collective, the community taken as a whole. And that community taken as a whole has its own social good. Again, and then utilitarianism, that's just the sum of the individual parts. And so here it seems that the corporate conception of the common good seems to sound a lot like the utilitarian conception of the greater good, right? So far we've seen this corporate conception of the common good about the individuals and their good, but then the collective's good being something separate. Sounds a lot like the greater good now. And yeah, utilitarianism is a great example of the corporate conception, though I should just note, to be fair, there's obviously other views that could have the corporate conception as well. It doesn't have to all be utilitarian. All right, so all that is how the corporate conception sets up the normative claim. So now let's go back to page 19. Look towards the top of the right-hand column and you'll see Alex say, given a corporate conception of the common good, something poses a threat to the common good, meets the triggering condition, only if it jeopardizes the continued existence or proper functioning of society as a whole. So when we're thinking about when we're thinking about the triggering condition, this has us ask, what constitutes a clear and present danger to the common good? And the corporate conception says, what constitutes a clear and present danger? Anything that threatens the continued existence or proper functioning of the society as a whole. And if you think about it for a moment, that initially seems like a really, really high bar. I mean, for something to count as a threat, that seems to be pretty hard to do, right? Because think about it this way. Many Americans died on 9/11, right? Many Americans died. But America as a country, America as a society was in no danger of being destroyed. The overwhelming majority of Americans were not in danger, right? And we'll come back to that in a moment because there's going to be some interesting thoughts to have about that. But let's just wrap up this initial kind of thing. Is like because you go back to page 19 here, and we can see on page 19 the corporate conception's understanding of the practical constraints. Quote, once something is deemed to threaten the common good, the corporate conception yields only the weakest possible practical constraint on what can be done in response. If the common good is identified with the continued existence of the community as a whole, then the practical constraint states that the means used to pursue or secure the common good may not themselves conflict with or subvert the continued existence of the community as a whole. So when we're thinking about the practical constraint, this has us again consider what are the boundaries, the limits in responding to threats to the common good. And the corporate conception says, well, you could do anything in response to the threat as long as that response doesn't threaten the continued existence or proper functioning of the community or society as a whole. And so now you can see that's pretty broad, because that means a lot of stuff may be sacrificed. A lot of individual lives may be fundamentally disrupted, but all that's okay as long as the community as a whole, continues to exist and function. And we've seen a lot of deaths can happen and the community can continue to function. And so we can see that the triggering condition seems to initially, the triggering condition seems to set a very high standard, right? It's a threat to the common good if the continued existence of the group is at stake. But look, once that condition is met and the survival of the community is at stake, then nearly anything may be done. No limits whatsoever as long as the community as a whole survives. I mean, talk about the end justifying the means. Wow. But however, it is worth noting, as we've seen already in previous modules, is that utilitarians and others may be less strict about what counts as that triggering condition. I mean, go back to the example of torturing the innocent children, right, to stop the terrorist attack. Look, a utilitarian would say, yes, sure, America as a whole may survive, the death of 1 million citizens, say. But, whoa, 1 million dead citizens seems to really count as a threat to the common good, to the greater good of society, right? And so now what we might start seeing is that there's might be a desire for a more lenient triggering condition. Yes, literally society doesn't have to crumble, but look, if it's something like 1 million deaths, that still seems to constitute a pretty serious threat to the corporate conception of the common good. But notice, again, once that trigger is met, whether it's strict or lenient, then you can do whatever is needed to protect society, right? And heck, we see the same thing with Michael Walzer, right? Michael Walzer also seems to assume this corporate conception, because he does argue that the political leader will have to get their hands dirty by acting to protect, the good of society, the common good, the greater good, the community as a whole. And yeah, Walzer says, of course, the leader, when doing that, is going to commit those crimes against morality, but those crimes, seem to need to be done in order to protect the good of the community as a whole. I mean, Walzer himself, he's not a utilitarian, but he does seem to be agreeing, at least with this corporate conception of the good of the whole. Once a triggering condition is met, there's going to be no limits to what you can do. Even great, moral crimes might be committed. Anyway, a lot of people seem to really like this corporate conception. So the debate really is usually around how strict or lenient that triggering condition should be. But they all agree, once the triggering condition is met, the gloves are off, man. And there will be very few limits on what may be done as long as it protects the existence of the community as a whole. And look, even as Walzer says, yeah, you might have to get your hands dirty. He's not a utilitarian, but he's still kind of like, yeah, the greater good. It's so elusive. I mean, so seductive, I should say. And so I think we're seeing all this in how the former U.S. diplomat William Jordan, remember him from a few videos ago, he thinks France will have to decide whether a triggering condition has been met. Again, do the Paris attacks constitute a threat to the continued existence of French society, I guess. And if this does count as a triggering condition being met, then this diplomat, Jordan is clearly saying, yeah, then you're going to probably have to give up some liberties in the name of security, for the common good, for the greater good. And so we're seeing that former diplomat, assuming again that you cannot have both security and individual liberties. This seems to be a pretty profound assumption on his part. He's saying you can't have both. You have to pick. There will be trade-offs between the two. If you want more security, you're going to lose some liberties. You want those liberties, fine, but your security is going to go down. But of course, if the triggering condition has been met, if this is a threat to the common good, the corporate conception of the common good of French society, that means civil liberties seem almost certainly to have to be sacrificed in the name of national security. Now, this is interesting because if you jump ahead to page 21 of Alex's article, look on the left-hand side column there on page 21, you can see Alex note that these type of trade-offs seem almost essential to the corporate conception, because here we see Alex saying, the corporate conception fosters zero-sum thinking, according to which the common good and the interest of individuals can be secured only at the expense of each other. Zero-sum thinking, very fancy language. That's actually it's one of the terms I think every college student should know, by the way. But anyway, by zero-sum thinking, Alex just means that we can't have both the common good and individual interests at the same time, especially in times of crisis and emergency. If you want one, you're going to have to give up some of the other. That's what zero-sum means in this context. If you want more of one, you get less of the other. And so, yeah, and especially in an emergency or a crisis, if the triggering condition has been met, that means the common good wins. And so that means that the common, if you can't have both and the common good wins, well, we know what loses then. That's the individual sacrifice, the interests of the individuals will have to be sacrificed. And again, I think we see the U.S. diplomat saying the same thing. He's saying you can't have both security and you can't have security along with individual rights. And well, look, if the common good's threatened, then security must win. And well, then what's the loser? Individual rights and liberties. I think that is a pretty American attitude. I won't lie. After 9/11, I think Americans really do, at least a lot of Americans think that way. But anyway, now Alex notes there are a couple problems with this corporate conception. First of all, he says that this corporate conception is too broad. That is, by too broad, he means it recognizes too many threats. That's kind of interesting, too many threats. Because think about it this way. Imagine, you're in the antebellum South. So this is in the Southern American states, before slavery, before slavery was ended, before the Civil War. And look, Southerners at that time might have saw abolition of slavery as a threat to the common good. Now let's pause. Of course, I hope we all agree with Mr. Green that the abolition of slavery was totally worth it. I love when he says that. But more generally, it seems, though, the problem here is that any kind of social reform or social progress could be a threat to the corporate conception of the common good, because such social progress might, like the abolition of slavery, required changing some fundamental social and cultural institutions. If the South to give up slavery, the South had to fundamentally change. And so you can imagine that especially white Southerners thought that this was a threat to the common good because it was fundamentally going to alter their society. And so this can also explain why some people who really are concerned with protecting culture, people who really want to protect culture, often are suspicious of liberties and rights because they see those liberties and rights as being tools to be used to undermine that culture they want to save. And so, yeah, if you think your culture is part of society and a change to that culture, undermines and changes society, yeah, that's a threat to the common good, at least if you're doing the corporate conception, absolutely a threat. So that's why the corporate conception seems too broad. Any change to society might be perceived as a threat. And it seems like some of those changes we should want, like slavery, totally worth it. Getting rid of that. Yeah, getting rid of slavery was totally worth it. Meanwhile, though, Alex also argues that the corporate conception is too narrow because in some other ways it recognizes too few threats. So yeah, it recognizes too many threats, that's broad, but it also at the same time recognizes too few of threats. Because the idea is that the corporate conception is consistent with abuse to minorities and other vulnerable groups, because it can ask those minorities and vulnerable groups to make considerable sacrifices as long as society as a whole, survives that. So again, in the name of the corporate conception of the common good, maybe Muslims in France, minority group, might be asked to give up certain fundamental rights in the name of national security. And you can use your imagination to think about how truly dark and scary that might actually become if you were a Muslim living in France. I mean, just a normal Muslim, this could be really profoundly affect you in deep ways. But again, the corporate conception can be fine with that. It can say, that's cool, it says, we can demand these great sacrifices, again, as long as the community as a whole survives and is not threatened as a whole by that. And of course, we've seen this issue again and again with all those criticisms about utilitarianism. Remember, we've seen utilitarianism being criticized as being too permissive. It doesn't allow for justice or individual rights. Because again, all those examples were showing that how individual rights could be sacrificed on the altar of the greater good. So that shouldn't be too surprising. So some problems with this corporate conception, and then a lot of those problems are similar to the problems we've seen with utilitarianism, because it's a pretty similar theory to utilitarianism. Anyway, we've seen a general outline now, just to summarize here, a general outline for how appeals to the common good work. Again, there's the three claims: a normative claim, a triggering condition, and a practical constraint. And now we've seen how the corporate conception responds to those three things. Again, the normative claim has us ask, what is the common good here? What are the individual interests at stake? And the corporate conception answers the common good is the greater good for society as a whole, while individual interests are those interests of the members of that society. And then the triggering condition has us ask what constitutes a clear and present danger to the common good. And the corporate conception answers anything that threatens the continued existence or proper functioning of society as a whole. That constitutes a clear and present danger to the common good. And of course, we've seen now that triggering condition can be very strict, or it might be lenient. Then that's a big source of debate. That might be the major debate between people who accept the corporate conception. How strict or lenient is that triggering condition? But then we come to, no matter how we decide that, then we finally come to the practical constraint, which has us consider what are the boundaries for responding to threats to the common good. And the corporate conception answers that just by answering, well, you can do anything as long as it doesn't threaten the continued existence or proper functioning of society as a whole. And this last point might be just, again, where the corporate conception gets a little scary, because once the common good has been deemed threatened, once the greater good, once the common good, once that's threatened, once the social good's threatened, there are few boundaries holding things back. The gloves are off. So that's the corporate conception of the common good. Though you might, as I said, you might think this really isn't the corporate conception of the common good. This seems still a conception of the greater good, that social entity, that's the greater good there. And that makes sense, because the corporate conception suggests that the social good is greater than the good of the individuals, members of that society, of that group. But of course, as I mentioned, when it came to those Paris attacks, there were those Europeans who did not want to think in terms of zero-sum trade-offs between national security and individual rights and liberty. And you might remember that I read that quote from I'm probably saying her name wrong, Zia Miral, who said that we need imaginations beyond this paradox. And so that's what I want to do next. But before we go into that, what those imaginations might look like, I think it's time for another break. So take a moment to relax your eyes, stand up, stretch your legs. I know we need to, oh man. And then once we've done all that, we can come back and finish up our discussion of conceptions of the common good.